What was the Cold War? The Cold War was a conflict between the US and the USSR, also known as the Soviet Union. The main conflict of the Cold War was the disagreement of communism and capitalism. The US supported capitalism, an economic system in which there is a free market. The USSR used the system of communism, which is a class system in which the government controlled people's lives and property rights. The economic system of communism is called Marxism, a system that oppressed all of the citizens under it to keep them in their separate classes. The Soviet government owned and controlled all factories, farms, and businesses. The USSR was formed in 1922 after the Russian Revolution. It started with just 4 countries: Russia, Belarus, the Ukraine, and the Transcaucasian Federation. Cold War was cold because there was no actual fighting, because any fighting would have led to nuclear war or World War III, which both sides agreed would result in their mutual destruction. The Cold War started in 1945 for 3 main reasons. The USSR was afraid US would try to control Europe through relief efforts after World War II. The US was worried the USSR would try to take over the world through spreading communism across Europe, which they tried to do, and the rivalries between the US and USSR caused by the nuclear arms race. They also caused tension by disputing the territory of Germany. After World War II, Germany was divided amongst the Allied powers, America, England, France, and the USSR. All of the new territories had borders in Berlin. The USSR then started Soviet bloc, forming a boundary of communist countries against the NATO capitalist countries. This split Europe into 2 parts, Eastern, the US, and Western. The capitalist countries like England and America started giving food rations and other supplies to oppressed people in the USSR, controlled East Berlin. Many Soviet Union citizens migrated across the border into NATO, controlled West Berlin to stop this Soviet Union from the Berlin Wall, which stretched across the Berlin border and had guards that would shoot anyone that tried to get across. The first major conflict in the Cold War was the nuclear arms race. Now we go to our new segment, the Nuclear News with Shannon Stewart.
Nuclear arms race was a competitive race between the US and Soviet Union for nuclear supremacy. It began with the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. In the beginning, the US was the only country in the world that possessed nuclear weapons. The first nuclear weapon was introduced during World War II, created to be used against the Axis powers. The Soviet Union was not informed of this study of nuclear weapons, also known as the Manhattan Project, because the US had not invested enough trust in the Soviets to keep these nuclear weapons plans from the Germans. August 1945, Germany had ordered to drop 2 atomic bombs, one for Hiroshima and the other for Nagasaki. Shortly after, the United Nations was founded to rid the world of nuclear weapons for good. The US continued with the nuclear research and growth of laboratories.
Another important conflict of the Cold War was the Cuban Missile Crisis, also known as the October Crisis or the Caribbean Crisis, was an important part of the conflict in the Cold War. It started on October 14, 1962 and ended only 14 days later on October 28th. It started with an American U-2 spy plane photographing a secret Soviet nuclear missile site in Cuba. President at the time, John F. Kennedy, didn't want the Soviet Union or Cuba to know what was discovered at the site, so he hid it. Then Kennedy put up a blockade up around Cuba to, quote, quarantine the problem. He did this so Soviets couldn't get any more supplies into Cuba. It was also then announced that weapons would not be delivered to Cuba. It was also demanded that any weapons still in the country be destroyed. After long meetings, Kennedy and the Soviet representatives publicly declared that the Soviets dismantle the weapons and return them to the Soviet Union, which the United Nations approved of, which caused conflict between US and the Soviet Union even though there was a compromise. Now we go to Cameron to the end of the Cold War.
How did the Cold War end? The Cold War officially ended in 1991 with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolvement of the Soviet Union, but it started slowing down in the early 1980s. There were many factors in the end of the USSR: the unraveling of the Soviet bloc, the proxy wars, new movements in the USSR from Mikhail Gorbachev, the collapse of the Soviet economy, and many more domestic and foreign changes and problems. And now we go to Alex Thomas for the proxy wars.
During the Cold War, many proxy wars took place. A proxy war is a war in which 2 or more great powers aid developing countries that are fighting the enemy power in some way without getting directly involved through financial and military aid. For both the Korean War and the Vietnam War, Americans decided to directly send American troops to assist the non-communist groups in Korea and Vietnam respectively. This caused these wars to be very unpopular with the American people, which had a smaller effect on the lesser-known Korean War when compared to the Vietnam War. In fact, the Vietnam War was so unpopular that the President Richard Nixon withdrew American troops from it. We learned from these 2 wars that it is a better idea to handle proxy wars completely and directly with financial aid rather than sending in troops. This idea was best shown in the Russian-Afghanistan War. During the Russian-Afghanistan War, the roles were flipped and the USSR were the ones directly sending in troops while America America was just providing financial aid. However, America was not alone. Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Iran, China, and Egypt also aided the Afghan rebel group, the Mujahideen. They succeeded, and America reaped the benefits. The conflict of these proxy wars were, of course, the indirect conflict between America and the USSR. The last of the proxy wars, the Russian-Afghan War, ended in 1979 when the USSR withdrew all troops from Afghanistan. And now back to Cameron with the impact of Mikhail Gorbachev.
Mikhail Gorbachev was a very important part of the end of communism. He worked to improve the economy, U.S. relations, and government infrastructure in the USSR. He became president of the USSR in 1985 after the death of the former president Konstantin Chernenko. Even though he was communist, Gorbachev had very American democratic political ideals that influenced his decisions as president. Domestic political actions of Mikhail Gorbachev were very important on the end of communism, specifically his two social political movements he created as president of the USSR. These movements were glasnost openness, which led Western ideas like freedom of religion, freedom of press in the USSR. The freedom of press allowed journalists to expose corrupt politicians, which led to civil unrest across the Union. And perestroika, which means restructuring, specifically politically and economically. Perestroika allowed market incentives to Soviet citizens and encouraged more democratic elections with multiple candidates. While perestroika and glasnost initially seemed like good ideas to Soviet officials, they later backfired, leading to the country's economic collapse. Gorbachev was also very effective in increasing tensions with the U.S. through self-compromise with the U.S. to decrease the number of medium to long-range nuclear missiles in the U.S. and USSR. And now we go to Kylie with the communist economy.
The USSR's economy was an extremely accurate embodiment of the entire country's development. The economy started strong when the country was founded and increased consistently for the next 40 years. The Soviet economy crashed in the early 80s, putting most of the country into severe poverty. The economic crash was caused by the billions of dollars spent on the fruitless Afghan war and other economic problems. Another contributor to the economic collapse was Gorbachev's movements of perestroika, attempts to restructure the economy by demonopolizing businesses and stopping government control pricing, which Soviet companies took advantage of these to exploit the citizens in poverty, causing more economic issues and increasing poverty rates across the nation. The sudden poverty across the USSR forced the government to set up food lines for all the citizens, which soon ran out, causing many families to go without food for days or weeks. The Glasnost movement allowed journalists to show the Soviet citizens how terrible the government was, which led to many people hating the government and calling for reforms, changing in powers, or the complete destruction of the USSR, which was a major reason for many of the revolutions. And now back to Alex.
Another factor in the downfall of the USSR was the unraveling of Soviet bloc. Soviet bloc, also known as Eastern Bloc, was Soviets' control of surrounding states, making them all communist and forcing them to join the USSR. In the late 1980s, many countries declared their independence from the Soviet Union, either through peaceful negotiations with the Soviet government or violent revolutions to overthrow dictators. One of the most impactful revolutions was the Romanian Revolution, aka the One-Week Revolution. The revolution started December 15, 1989 as protests against dictator Nicolae Ceausescu for the food shortage. He refused to follow the perestroika movement and the cruel and violent secret police that suppressed all rebellions. On the 17th, he told generals to order their soldiers to shoot protesters, but when they refused, he told the soldiers directly, but only some of them listened, killing 7 to 100 people on the ground. On the 22nd, revolutionaries stormed the president's office. He escaped by helicopter. Ceausescu and his wife found, tried, and executed on live TV by the Christmas of that year. The new democratic government immediately outlawed death penalty and left the USSR. This greatly hurt the USSR because Romania controlled the largest spy network in the Soviet Union. And now back to Cameron.
On August 12, 1961, the Berlin Wall was built by the Soviet Union to separate East and West Berlin, and to keep refugees from the oppressive Soviet Union from escaping into the NATO and America-controlled West Berlin. The Berlin Wall was a symbol of Soviet separation from the rest of the world, and the Soviet Union's attempt to keep their citizens in the dark about events in the rest of the world. On November 9, 1989, the destruction of the Berlin Wall began on both sides, tearing down brick by brick. The destruction of the Berlin Wall was one of the most well-known compromises in the Cold War. The fall of the Berlin Wall started on November 9, 1989, when people on both sides of the wall started tearing it down, because new government regulations allowed citizens to have permanent passports to leave East Berlin. New immigration rules were not told to the guards on the Berlin Wall, and when thousands of Soviet citizens tried to cross the wall with passports, there was mass chaos at the border. To prevent riots and more chaos, the guards allowed the crowds to cross the wall into Western Europe. Now that there was no use for the wall, people on both sides took chisels and hammers to it and started to break it down. The wall was mostly destroyed, with some small pieces being left up to this day. Germany was not officially reunified until October 9, 1990. The fall of the Berlin Wall resolved one of the largest conflicts of the Cold War, which was the separation of Germany. The reunification of Germany also an important event in the Cold War because it showed the Soviet Union was becoming more democratic and less oppressive, which meant they were becoming more similar to the U.S., more likely to start to create international relationships and make more compromises with the U.S.
Why was the Cold War important? The Cold War was a very influential time for the world. Throughout history, we can witness how the war had a conflict and compromise theme. From the first disagreement of communism and capitalism to the fall of the Berlin Wall, one can distinguish the foreshadowing of many conflicts to come. The Cold War proved to be a difficult time for the U.S., but in the end, the conflict had been solved and Germany divided into separate territories, yet remained close together in the final compromise.